Hello friends, welcome again. Friends, John Keats, the poet of love, who lived during the Romantic Revival, has rightly said that if poetry does not come as naturally as leaves to a tree, it had better not come at all. John Keats wanted to say that the art of writing poetry is natural, is spontaneous. Poetry comes to a poet as leaves naturally come to a tree. And friends, when we talk about Edmund Spenser as a poet, this statement of John Keats is applied to his poetry. Truly, Edmund Spenser's poetry is natural. Spenser is a natural, spontaneous poet to whom, poetry comes as naturally as leaves come to a tree. Friends, in this video, today we want to discuss Spenser's contribution to English poetry. We are going to analyze Edmund Spenser as the poet's poet. Friends, Alexander Pope has eulogized Spenser, has appreciated Edmund Spenser by saying that there is something in Spenser that pleases one as strongly as in one's old age as it did in one's youth. That means Pope wanted to say that Spenser's poetry is universal poetry. Spenser's poetry is the poetry for all times. Spenser's poetry pleases us when we are young and it pleases us when we are old. Alexander Pope, the poet of the 18th century, he appreciated Edmund Spenser in this manner. And indeed, Spenser is the supreme poet of the world. He is perhaps the most illuminating and volcanic sun in the galaxy of English Renaissance during the 16th century. Charles Lamb, who himself is known as the Prince of English Essays, he has remarked that Spenser is the poet's poet. That means he wanted to say that Edmund Spenser is not an ordinary poet. He is, in fact, the poet of the greatest poets of English literature. Let's have a look at Spenser's major works which he wrote during his lifetime during the Renaissance period. He wrote an epic, The Faerie Queene. He wrote Shepherd's Calendar, written in 12 cantos. He wrote the Four Hymns, the Mother's Hebert's Tale, the Complaints, the Emeraude songs and all. His contribution to English poetry is immense. And that is the reason why he has been considered as an extraordinary poet. Spenser is regarded as the poet's poet in more than one ways. Spenser is the poet not of common man, but only of the scholars and of the great poets who are well versed in classical and humanistic studies. That means what I want to say that Spenser's poetry is not for a common reader. If you want to understand Spenser's poetry, you need to be well versed with classical and humanistic studies. Poetry of Edmund Spenser can really be interpreted by only those people, only those readers who are familiar with classical writers like Petrarch, like Ronsard, Ariosto, Tasso, Plato and Aristotle. Why? Because there are so many references to these great poets like Homer, Petrarch, Ronsard, Ariosto, Tasso, and all. Okay, when we read Edmund Spenser's poetry, we must be first of all familiar with these great poets of the world, great thinkers of the world, great philosophers of the world. There are hundreds of allusions and references to classical writers and classical mythology. And if you want to appreciate Edmund Spenser's poetry, you you need to be familiar with three great traditions of this European culture. One who wants to enjoy Spenser's poetry, he requires to have thorough knowledge, complete knowledge of the pastoral tradition of Virgil, number one. Number two, the romantic and moral tradition of Tasso and Ariosto. And number three, the readers must have thorough knowledge of the philosophical tradition of Plato and Aristotle. And that is one of the reasons why Spenser's poetry is not ordinary poetry. Another reason why Spenser is considered as the poet's poet is that Spenser had very high value for English poetry. Now, this pastoral tradition, the philosophical tradition that we just now discussed, that never was the intention of Charles Lamb when he announced Spenser as the poet's poet. Charles Lamb had some other reasons, achievements of Spenser in his mind when he announced him as such a supreme master of English poetry. It was Edmund Spenser and not Chaucer who gave to English poetry and poets a place nearer to God, the great maker. Spenser believed that the poet is the chosen agent of God. He thought that any ordinary poet is directly connected to God, from whom he receives everlasting inspiration to write divine poetry. So Spenser was the first poet in the entire history of English literature who believed that there is a relationship between the poet and the God. God inspires the poets, and the poets write divine poetry only after that divine inspiration of God. He thought that any ordinary poet, if he wants to write poetry, must first of all be inspired by God. So he had this high conception, high opinion for the poets and poetry. And in giving a higher conception of the poets and poetry, Spenser did something new which other poets before him did not do. And that's why, he is considered as the poet's poet. Spenser is considered as the poet's poet because he set about to perform that great work for the glorification of English poetry, which was not done by any poets even before Edmund Spenser. Chaucer was an important poet who wrote poetry during the 14th century. No doubt he wrote poetry of high order, but he could not stand comparison with the poetry of the other great European writers like Petrarch. It was left to Edmund Spenser, who endowed England with poetry great in kind, great in style, and great in thought. He showed the world that modern England is capable of poetry as great as that of any other age, or that she means England, has her share of poetic power, of art and learning. So, this is why it is not Chaucer, but it is Edmund Spenser who is considered as the poet's poet. Let's move ahead and see what other contributions that he has made to English poetry. Friends, from ages there has been a perpetual controversy, an eternal debate going on among the scholars, among the critics regarding the function of poetry. What actually is the primary function of poetry? This has been a debatable issue since ages. Okay, the moralists like Plato have emphasized that poetry should be moral and it should be an instrument of teaching moral lessons. On the other hand, there are some other critics and writers who believed in the philosophy of art for art's sake. Okay, and some other critics, yet another critics, they opined that poetry must please the readers. It must delight the readers. Okay, they believed that the poet is an angel of joy and delight. But it is to the credit of Edmund Spenser that he harmonized all these different theories regarding the function of poetry in his poetry which he wrote, like the Fairy King, the Fairy Queen, the Shepherd's Calendar, the Emeraude songs and all. In fact, Spenser is a poet in whom you find moral messages, you find the beauty of art, and at the same time his poetry delights and pleases the reader. His poetry is moralistic and at the same time it is full of joy, delight and romance. And that is the reason why, friends, Spenser is considered as an extraordinary poet. Let's now talk about Spenser's contribution to English language. It was Edmund Spenser's great achievement to have improved English diction, English style and English versification. Diction means the language, the choice and arrangement of words in poetry, in literature. He has improved the existing diction which was used during the Elizabethan Age. He has not only improved the diction but also style and versification of English poetry. He enriched the English language and made it musical and a fit medium for the English poets. William Shakespeare, he presented a beautiful mixture of Old English words and Greek words. In the same manner, Spenser also imported so many hundreds of foreign words and he coined new words in English language. English language is enriched by Spenser's poetry. Not only this, he sometimes altered the meanings of the words. That means he made one word do the duty of another, and he also interchanged actives and passives in English poetry. And that's why his poetic style became a royal style which was beautiful, flexible and magnificent. Spenser's contribution to English language, to English versification is immense, and that is why he is considered as the poet's poet. But Spenser's greatest contribution was his introduction of Spenserian stanza, which firmly established itself as the most suitable meter for all kinds of narrative and reflective poetry in the entire English literature. Spenser innovated new medium of expression in English poetry, which was later on known as the Spenserian stanza, and this innovation was considered as the greatest contribution of Edmund Spenser. This Spenserian stanza exercised the deepest influence on most of the Romantic poets during the 19th century. It was admirably used by the poets like James Thomson during the 18th century, John Keats, P.B. Shelley during the 19th century, Lord Byron, Alfred Tennyson during the Victorian era. Davies, one of the important critics of English literature, has rightly remarked that the Spenserian stanza is most purely English by nature and decent. And this is how we may say that Spenser's contribution to English poetry is great in comparison to Geoffrey Chaucer and other poets. In this manner, let's conclude by saying that Spenser was indeed the poet of the great poets of English literature. He exercised marvelous influence on a host of poets during the 17th, 18th and 19th centuries. Milton, John Milton, who lived during the 17th century, Milton himself, became a much greater poet after reading Spenser's The Faerie Queene. We know that John Milton has written the one and only epic of English poetry, The Paradise Lost. But Milton first of all read The Faerie Queene, which is again claimed to be an epic of English poetry. After reading that, Milton, became the master in the art of writing epic poetry. There are, in fact, Edmund Spenser has coached so many hundreds of poets of English literature. He is the teacher to so many poets, so many great poets of English literature. It is a known fact, that Dryden also confessed that Spenser had been his master in his lifetime. The other poets like Lodge and Drayton, they also paid tribute to this great master and called him learned, revered and excellent. According to them, according to Lodge and Drayton, Spenser is learned, revered and excellent. Wordsworth also finds Spenser as the embodiment of nobility, purity and sweetness. And that's why Wordsworth, who is himself the poet of nature, he wrote these lines, these poetic lines for Edmund Spenser. The gentle bard, bard means poet, the gentle bard, sweet Spenser, moving through the clouded heaven with the moon's beauty and moon's soft pace, I called him brother, Englishman and friend. Wordsworth respects Edmund Spenser as an elder brother, an Englishman and as a friend. So friends, here I put an end to this discussion by saying that Edmund Spenser was indeed the poet's poet. Friends, I hope you liked the video. Please share this video among your friends. Thank you very much.